No one knew what to do until Jesus appeared. What if I told you that there is a story about Jesus that few people know? A story so surprising that it can change the way you see Jesus' miracles. Have you ever heard of the day when Jesus saved a child about to drown? This mysterious story is not in the traditional Gospels, but has circulated among ancient accounts and forgotten writings. What really happened that day? How did Jesus act in the face of a family's despair? Get ready to discover another one of unknown stories of Jesus. A story that makes us question how far the power of faith goes and the impact of Jesus' presence among us. This is not just another narrative about miracles, but rather a miracle that left witnesses speechless. A moment in which Jesus showed once again that he was always in the right place at the right time. Now, imagine the scene. A simple village, a peaceful afternoon, children playing near the river, until a scream cuts through the air. Desperation. And takes over. Nobody knows what to do. But then Jesus appears among the crowd, and what happens next is something that few know about, but that will never be forgotten. Stay with me until the end, because this story may surprise you in ways you never imagined. But before we continue, I need to warn you about something important. This is the only YouTube channel dedicated to telling unknown stories of Jesus. Exciting, mysterious stories, miracles that almost no one knows about. And you know what's most incredible? You are part of that select group of people who are discovering these stories now. I'm sure you like this type of story and that you'll want to follow many other incredible ones. Then leave your like now, and furthermore, sign up to always be one of the first to have access to these surprising stories. In the end, how many people do you know who have heard this story? Probably almost no one. And that's exactly why I want to know your opinion. Do you believe there are miracles of Jesus that have never been recorded? Comment below, because I read all the comments and I really want to know what you think about this. Now let's continue this story of Jesus, because what happened next, it will give you goosebumps. The village was hidden among weathered hills, a small spot of life amidst an arid and challenging landscape. The paths were made of dirt, marked by the comings and goings of residents and their animals, creating winding trails that led from the houses to the plantations and finally to the large river. This river, which meandered through the rocks like a vital artery, it was both a gift and a threat to those who depended on it. The sun, merciless, poured its rays over the village from the early hours of the morning. The stone and clay houses tried, almost naively, to resist the scorching heat of the desert. Made by calloused hands, they supported entire families under straw and wooden slat roofs, protecting them from the heat of the day and the cold of the night. Time there seemed to flow differently, dragging along slowly, while life unfolded in simple gestures and routines that never seemed to change. The streets were narrow, crossed by small makeshift markets, where villagers exchanged supplies and goods. Women carried clay jugs balanced on their heads, transporting precious water taken from the river. Men traded pieces of tanned leather, dried fish and figs, harvested from trees that grew in less arid areas. The sounds of everyday life filled the air. The distant lowing of oxen, the bleating of goats, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and of course the laughter of children, always vibrant, always present. Life was simple, but it wasn't easy. The villagers knew that each day was an achievement and that each resource needed to be used wisely. Water, in particular, was treated as a sacred commodity. Without it, nothing could survive. And for this reason, the river was revered as much as it was feared. This river was, for many, the fine line between survival and destruction. Its waters sparkled under the sun, reflecting golden and bluish tones that seemed inviting at first glance. However, those who lived there knew that this tranquility was only apparent. The current hid dangers that were not always visible to the inattentive eye. Every year, someone was taken away. An animal, a careless person, a child who didn't listen to his parents' warnings. The river took its toll, and those who respected it knew how to. And keep a safe distance. The trees near the watercourse were few but resistant. Their gnarled trunks seemed to have fought for every drop of moisture, and their roots clung to the rocky soil as if they were fully aware of how valuable the land was. Small bushes grew on the shore, and among the larger stones, frogs and insects hid from the scorching heat. Nature was tough, but somehow it resisted. Mothers always warned their children not to get too close to the river. They said he was treacherous, that he could be calm one moment and then pull anything in his way the next. The elders told stories of when the river overflowed after distant rains, washing away land and destroying crops. Some said he had a mind of his own, that he took away those who didn't respect him. Even so, the children saw the river differently. For them, it was a refuge from the heat, a place of adventure, a setting for games and challenges. They liked to see who could throw rocks the farthest, who could find the brightest fish, or who could get their feet wet without being scolded. The attraction to the river was inevitable, despite the adults' warnings and fear. On that particular day, the sun was especially strong. The villagers went about their tasks as usual. Some men were in the fields, checking their crops and talking about the harvest. Others repaired fishing nets and sharpened knives to cut meat. In the center of the village, traders shouted their offers, trying to sell dried figs, wheat, and hand-dyed fabrics. Near the river, some women were washing clothes, rubbing the fabrics vigorously against the smooth stones. The sound of the lapping water was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and their voices mingled in low conversations about recent events. Between one sentence and another, they cast quick glances at the children playing nearby, ensuring that none were venturing beyond what was allowed. Children ran barefoot over the hot rocks, ignoring the heat and enjoying every moment of freedom. Some played by jumping over logs that were partially submerged, testing their balance. Others picked up small dry branches and released them into the current, watching them being carried downstream as if they were boats on an unknown journey. For them, that was a normal day, without worries, without apparent dangers. The water ran lazily, reflecting the blue of the sky. Small whirlpools formed occasionally, slowly rotating before dissipating. Birds came to drink on the bank, flapping, their wings quickly before taking off again. Everything seemed to be in harmony, but that river did not forgive distractions. And that day, while the children's laughter echoed through the village and the adults went about their routines, no one noticed that, in a corner of the bank, a boy was watching the water with a curious look. He saw something floating, something small, dancing in the current. Maybe it was a leaf, a piece of wood, a fish swimming near the surface. He moved a little closer. He felt the cold stone beneath his feet. The river seemed to call him, whispering promises of adventure. The boy did not know that, in a matter of moments, the fate of that village would change forever. The heat that afternoon seemed even more intense than usual. The sun shone brightly in the sky, with no clouds that could mitigate its strength. The wind was blowing gently, lifting small grains of sand that danced through the air before settling again on the parched ground. The village went about its routine, with men working in the fields and women busy with daily tasks, while children ran free, laughing and playing as if time didn't exist. The river, with its calm and inviting appearance, meandered through the landscape, reflecting the sunlight in small golden sparkles. The waters seemed calm at first glance, but beneath the surface, the current hid its true strength. Anyone who had lived there long enough knew that the river was treacherous, silent, unpredictable, and merciless towards those who underestimated him. But children did not have this perception of danger. For them, the river was a setting for adventure, an invitation to games that tested their courage. Among them, a 6-year-old boy stood out. He was restless, curious, and fearless. Always looking for new challenges, He liked to impress his friends with his audacity, even if it meant taking a little more risk than he should. That day, while the other children threw rocks into the river and ran among the nearby trees, he fixed his attention on something floating in the water. It was just a leaf, slowly rotating, being carried by the current as if it were dancing to the sound of invisible music. But for him, that leaf became a little challenge. He wanted to catch her before she left. The warm wind rushed through his disheveled hair as he approached the river's edge, his bare feet touching the smooth, damp stone of the bank. He leaned in a little more, eyes fixed on the slowly receding object. The sound of laughter all around seemed distant now. The world seemed to have shrunk to just him and that floating leaf. He knew he had to act quickly before she was taken away. His heart beat faster, not out of fear, but out of the excitement of the moment. One small step forward, one more, just one more, and he would reach her. Then the inevitable happened. The stone beneath his feet was slippery, polished by constant contact with the water. When he tried to stretch a little more, his balance was lost. Time seemed to slow down as he realized he couldn't hold on. His hands opened in the air in a late reflex of trying to grab something, but there was nothing there. The boy's body fell forward, and in an instant, he disappeared into the river. The impact was sudden. The water completely surrounded his body, closing in on him as if it had a life of its own. The unexpected cold took over his senses, and for a moment he didn't know what was up or down. The current pulled him out immediately, dragging him with a force much greater than he could imagine. What once seemed like a serene river was now a death trap, and he was trapped in it. Nearby children abruptly stopped their play. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The sound of running water remained the same, as if nothing had happened, but then one of the girls saw the boy's small body emerging and submerging in the water, being carried by the invisible force of the current. A scream rent the air, the women washing clothes. Beyond looked up, their hands still gripping the wet fabrics. For a moment their brains didn't process what they were seeing, but as soon as they understood, chaos began. The boy's mother was the first to react. His heart raced in his chest as if it were going to explode. His legs moved before his mind even processed what was happening. The jug he was holding slipped from his hands and broke into pieces on the sand. Her feet hit the ground with immense force as she ran, her breath coming in short, desperate sobs. The sound of her scream made the men drop everything and run to see what was happening, and then they saw it. The current dragged the boy further and further away. Her small body tried to emerge, arms flailing, legs kicking frantically. He swallowed water, coughed, tried to scream, but each time he managed to rise to the surface, was pulled back down. Desperation took over the crowd. The men ran along the bank, following the flow of the river, desperately searching for a piece of wood, a rope, anything they could use to reach the boy. But he was already too far gone. Some tried to enter the water, but retreated as soon as they felt the force of the current pushing them forward. They knew what would happen if they tried to advance any further. No one there was strong enough to fight the river. The boy's mother fell to her knees in the sand, hands over her face, unable to breathe. His son was disappearing before his eyes, and no one could do anything. Panic spread through the crowd. Some women were crying, some children clung to their mothers, scared. The sound of distressed voices filled the air, but none of them had a solution. Everyone was witnessing a tragedy in real time, and they were powerless to stop it. The boy, in turn, he began to feel his body losing strength. His arms felt heavy, his legs didn't kick as energetically. Fatigue set in quickly, and the water seemed to be getting colder and colder around him. His vision was blurred. He wanted to scream, he wanted to call his mother, but he couldn't anymore. Then, in a last flash of consciousness, he saw the sky. The sun was shining brightly, creating a golden reflection on the water. It seemed so far away, so unattainable. He felt his eyelids get heavy. The sound around him became a distant echo. He no longer knew whether he was going up or down. The world began to darken, and then he stopped fighting. The river, relentless, continued its course. The crowd on the bank screamed and cried, but nothing changed. Time seemed to have stopped, and a single question hung in the air. Would this be the end? What if this happened today? If you were there, seeing everything with your own eyes, feeling the despair in the air, hearing the screams, seeing the water take someone away, what would you do? How would you react to seeing Jesus defying the impossible and bringing hope when everything seemed lost? I want to know your opinion right here in the comments. Desperation took over, but there was still hope. I know this story has stuck with you so far, so share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Some stories cannot be forgotten. They need to be told. And what happens next is something no one could ever imagine. Despair dominated the village. Every second that passed was a sentence, a cruel reminder that the boy's life was slipping away before the eyes of his mother and everyone present. The river, merciless, took his small body further and further away, draining his strength, taking away his chance to survive. He was fighting, but it was an unfair fight. The water was too strong, too cold, too unforgiving, and in the hearts of everyone there, a terrible truth settled. They couldn't do anything. The screams echoed through the village, the women's cries mixed with the desperate pleas of the men who ran along the bank without knowing how to act. No one there knew how to swim well enough to face that current. Nobody was fast enough. Nobody was strong enough. The boy's mother was on her knees, her trembling hands clutching the sand, her face bathed in tears. She didn't want to believe what her eyes were seeing. His heart hammered in his chest as if he wanted to escape, as if he refused to accept reality. His entire body was shaking, not from the cold, but from the absolute terror of losing his son. It was a pain that ripped through her soul, a terror she had never felt before. But in the midst of the chaos, someone was walking through the village. It was a presence that no one had noticed before. A man was coming through the dusty streets, passing the stone and mud houses, the old carts leaning against the shadows of the few trees. He walked no rush, no hesitation, as if he knew exactly where he needed to be. His face was serene, untouched by the panic that consumed everyone. The sun reflected off his face differently, as if the light recognized him. The dust of the path rose subtly under his feet, but he seemed not to care about the heat, the despair around him, nor even the confused looks of some villagers who, for a brief moment, noticed his presence. Jesus had arrived. He didn't move with the frenzy of others. I didn't run, I didn't scream. But he was also not oblivious to the suffering that unfolded before him. His eyes, deep and full of something that no one there could understand, saw far beyond what the villagers saw. He saw the boy. I saw her pain, her fear, her struggle, but I saw something more. The residents continued to panic, still unable to realize that among them I was the only person who could change that destiny, until finally the first eyes turned to him. It was the boy's mother. Your shallow breathing, your uncontrolled sobs, all of that stopped for a brief moment when your gaze met his. She couldn't understand why, but something inside her changed at that moment. She was still desperate, but somehow she no longer felt alone. Other people began to notice his presence. The voices in the crowd began to die down. The tears were still flowing, the sobs were still suffocated in the throats of some, but the hysteria that took over the village began to subside. There was something different about this man. One of the villagers, an elderly man with a long beard and a weathered face, touched another's shoulder and pointed in his direction. He didn't say anything, but the gesture was enough to make more eyes turn. And then the buzz started. Who's that? Where did he come from? What is he doing here? The questions came quietly, almost whispered, as if the people themselves didn't know if they wanted the answers. But no one dared to interrupt him. Jesus continued walking. He approached the shore, his feet sinking lightly into the damp sand. The crowd made room for him without realizing it, as if something made them give way. Instinctively, he looked at the river. The boy was still there, but not for long. The current carried him quickly. His movements were slower now. His fight was coming to an end. His small body no longer resisted with the same intensity as before. Fatigue dominated him. The villagers watched in silence. They expected something, but no one knew what. Jesus stopped for a moment. His gaze was fixed on the boy, but he showed no fear. There was no panic, there was no rush. There was only certainty. His gaze moved from the child to the crowd. He observed those faces filled with fear, despair, and a feeling of helplessness. He saw beyond the tears, beyond the choked screams. He saw faith wavering within them. Then he took a step forward. The dust that hung in the air seemed to settle. The wind blew gently, as if even he was waiting for what would come next. People held their breath. What would he do? Would he give an order? Would he ask someone to try to rescue the boy? Would he just kneel and pray? No. Jesus just started walking towards the river, and it was at that moment that something inexplicable happened. Silence took over the village. Every breath seemed suspended in the air. Every gaze was fixed on that scene that no one would ever forget. Jesus walked, but it wasn't an ordinary walk. It wasn't just any movement. He was heading straight for the river. The villagers didn't know what to do. They had screamed, cried, despaired in the face of the inevitable. But now, something different was happening. Something that defied everything they knew. Jesus didn't run. He didn't show fear. He didn't hesitate. His countenance was serene, and his gaze carried absolute certainty. He knew exactly what he was about to do. The boy's mother, who was still kneeling in the sand, watched everything with red, teary eyes. Despair still enveloped her, but now there was something new growing inside her. It was a feeling she could barely name. It wasn't just hope, it was faith. Jesus took a few more steps, and then he did the unthinkable. He entered the water, but didn't sink. The shock was immediate. Some people screamed, others simply held their breath. Jesus was not swallowed by the river as any other mortal would have been. He was not dragged by the current. He did not stagger. He did not fight against the waters. He just walked, as if he was walking on solid ground. The villagers' wide eyes reflected the impossible. What they were seeing didn't make sense. The river didn't touch him. His feet moved smoothly over the surface without the water trying to pull him down. He walked on water. The murmurs began. That's not possible. Is he walking on the river? How could this be happening? The crowd, previously overcome by despair, was now dominated by a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. Never, ever had anyone witnessed anything like this. The water that should swallow, the water that should consume, the water that took lives had no power over him. The furious current that dragged the boy mercilessly. He didn't move Jesus even an inch. He simply advanced, firm, constant, as if nature itself bowed to his presence. From the middle of the river, the boy continued to be dragged. His arms felt heavy, his lungs burned from lack of air. He could no longer fight with the same strength. His little life slipped like grains of sand between the fingers of time. But then something happened. Even in the midst of the torpor that dominated him, even with his senses numbed by despair and tiredness, he felt a presence. His body, which no longer reacted as before, had one last impulse. His eyes opened, even though the water tried to blind him. And that's when he saw it. Jesus was coming to him. The boy blinked, not understanding what he saw. His confused mind told him it was impossible. No one could be there. The current was too strong. The river took everything away. But there he was. The boy's face was half submerged, but his vision was fixed on that figure that advanced without being touched by the river. The boy wanted to say something. I wanted to call, but didn't need to, because Jesus was already there. The boy's last strength was extinguished. He could no longer stay afloat. His body sank. The water pulled him down, away from the sunlight, away from life. And then the hand of Jesus reached him. It was a simple touch, but charged with something indescribable. The force that the river had on the boy disappeared instantly. The crowd watched, their hearts pounding, their eyes fixed on the scene they would never be able to forget. Jesus didn't fight the water. He did not pull the child with effort, as an ordinary man would do. No, as calmly as he had walked on the river, he simply lifted the boy. The boy's chin broke the surface first, then his chest, then his entire body. He emerged as if the river no longer had any power over him. The crowd exclaimed in shock. Some people knelt down. Others covered their mouths with their hands, unable to believe what they were witnessing. It was a miracle. The child, who until a second before was drowning, was now in Jesus' arms, safe, untouched, as if death had never approached her. The boy's mother fell to the ground, her legs too weak to support her. Thick tears rolled down her face, but they were no longer tears of despair. The villagers looked at Jesus, at the boy, at the river, trying to understand, trying to process the impossible. What they just saw defies explanation. Jesus said nothing. He just turned his gaze to the crowd. And at that moment, every person there I knew I was facing something much bigger than any of them could understand. The boy, in his arms, blinked a few times, still confused. But he was no longer afraid. He looked at Jesus, and for the first time since it all began, he smiled. What if you saw this happen today? If you were standing in front of Jesus, seeing with your own eyes him walk on the water and defy nature itself, how would you react? Would you believe what you were seeing, or would you doubt the impossible? I want to know your opinion. Write here in the comments, nothing is impossible for Jesus. I'm sure this story has moved you so far. Share it with someone who needs this message. Some stories cannot be forgotten. They need to be told. And what happens next is something no one could ever imagine. The silence that fell over the village was almost as powerful as the miracle that had just occurred. No words, no sounds. Just the gentle rustling of the wind and the sound of running water, as if the river itself was acknowledging Jesus' authority. Everyone was in shock. The wide eyes of the villagers followed Jesus every step as he returned to shore, carrying in her arms the boy who, just moments before, was condemned to death. The child was safe, alive, breathing normally. His small body, which had previously struggled desperately against the current, now rested peacefully. The weight of despair had been replaced by miracle. Jesus' every movement was watched with amazement. It was as if time itself had stopped to witness the impossible. The water ran down his feet, but did not submerge him. Every step on the waves seemed to belie the laws of the natural world. The river, which previously showed its strength by dragging the boy mercilessly, was now submissive to his presence. People didn't know how to react. Some covered their mouths with their hands. Others had tears running down their faces without even realizing it. The miracle was undeniable. The boy's mother was motionless. Her eyes were fixed on the scene before her, but her heart still couldn't believe what she saw. Her legs shook, unable to support her, and she fell to her knees in the sand, pressing her hands to her chest. She was in front of something she never imagined she would see in her entire life. The boy opened his eyes slowly. The warmth of Jesus' arms enveloped him, bringing him a comfort he couldn't describe. He was saved. There was no more fear. The sound of the river no longer seemed threatening. He turned his head slightly, seeing the expressions of the villagers, all looking at him as if he was the most precious thing in the world at that moment. And then someone fell to their knees. It was one of the men from the village, an elderly fisherman, his skin marked by the sun and hard work. His eyes were full of tears. He couldn't contain the awe he felt. Another villager did the same, then another, and another one. One by one, everyone fell to their knees before Jesus. Many people's eyes were red from crying. Some sobbed uncontrollably, unable to contain their emotions. What they had just witnessed, it wasn't just a rescue, it wasn't just an act of courage, it was a miracle, something none of them would ever forget. Jesus said nothing. He didn't need to. He continued walking slowly, each step marking the wet earth. The boy was still in his arms. There was no rush, there was no commotion. The only sound was the muffled murmur of the villagers, who were trying to comprehend what had just happened. And then, Jesus stopped. He was in front of the child's mother. She was still kneeling, tears streaming down her face. His breathing was ragged, his body was shaking, but no longer from fear. Now, it was emotion. Jesus, with the same serenity as before, slightly bent down, and with great care handed the boy back to his mother. She hesitated. His fingers trembled as he touched his son's warm skin. For a moment, she was afraid that this was all a dream, that her son would disappear from her arms as soon as she held him. But when she finally hugged him to her chest, she felt her heart pounding. He was there, alive. A cry of relief escaped his lips. She began to cry even more, but now they were tears of gratitude. His arms squeezed his son tightly, as if they would never let him go again. She kissed his forehead, his wet hair, repeating his name between sobs. The other women were crying too. Some hugged each other, sharing the emotion of seeing that unbelievable outcome. The men were silent, not because they didn't feel the same emotion, but because they were completely overwhelmed by the impact of what they had witnessed. One of them, a strong man, his hands calloused from working in the fields, rubbed his eyes as if trying to make sure this was real. He looked at Jesus, his lips trembling, trying to say something, but the words just wouldn't come. The only thing he could do was kneel once more, his forehead touching the ground in a gesture of absolute reverence. Others followed suit. In a few seconds, the entire crowd was prostrate before him. It wasn't fear, it was something bigger than that. It was respect, it was recognition, it was faith. The child's mother raised her face, bathed in tears, and looked at Jesus. His mouth opened, as if he wanted to say something, but his voice trailed off. She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to say something that expressed how she felt, but how can she put a miracle into words? She just cried, holding her son in her arms, unable to look away from Jesus. And so she did what her heart told her. With her son still in her lap, she bowed before him. The boy looked at his mother, then at Jesus. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he felt something different inside of him, something he would carry for the rest of his life. The children, who had previously been paralyzed, began to move. Some of them, shy, approached and touched Jesus' clothes, as if they wanted to feel a little of that inexplicable power. The older ones murmured among themselves, trying to find an explanation for what they saw, but there was no possible explanation. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He is not an ordinary man." Another replied, almost without a voice, "He is sent from God." Jesus observed everything in silence. His look was one of love, of compassion. He didn't expect recognition. He didn't want exaltation. All that mattered to him was that that life had been saved. And at that moment, everyone knew they were facing something much bigger than they could understand. Silence still dominated the village. The sound of the wind gently swaying the leaves of the few trees and the rustling of people's clothes was all that could be heard. The weight of the miracle hung in the air like something almost palpable. Everyone there knew they would never forget that moment. Jesus remained standing, his expression serene, his eyes reflecting a peace that contrasted with the disbelief still on the faces of the crowd. He didn't seem surprised by what had happened. For him, this was not a great feat, but just another demonstration of divine love and power. The boy, still held in his arms, looked at Jesus with admiration. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he felt something inside him that he would never feel again. a warmth, a safety, an inexplicable certainty. The villagers were paralyzed, their knees still digging into the ground, their minds trying to find words to describe what they had just witnessed. The impossible had happened before his eyes. The river, which so many feared, he had been challenged and defeated with a simple touch. It was then that Jesus raised his face and looked at the crowd. His gaze, penetrating and full of compassion, passed over everyone present there. He saw the doubt in their hearts. He saw the astonishment. He saw the fear that still held them back. But most of all, he saw the faith that was beginning to blossom within them. His gaze stopped at the boy's mother, who was still kneeling, her face marked by new, dry tears that fell uncontrollably. His eyes were red. His breathing was still ragged, but now there was a different glow in them, an understanding she didn't possess before. It was at that moment that Jesus finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled every space, reaching every person there. It was firm but sweet, filled with something that no one could explain. It was a voice that brought answers without needing questions. Faith can move mountains, but it can also save lives. Those words passed through the silence like a powerful wave, shaking everyone there from the inside out. It wasn't just a teaching, it was a living truth, irrefutable proof that faith, when true, transcended all barriers. The villagers felt a shiver run through their bodies. They had just seen it happen. They saw a boy sentenced to death be saved in an inexplicable way. They saw Jesus walk on the water as if it were dry land. And now, faced with these words, something changed in them. The boy's mother put a hand to her mouth, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back a sob. That phrase echoed inside her like an unquestionable truth. She almost lost her son. For an instant, despair had completely consumed her. But in the darkest moment, in the moment when everything seemed lost, something bigger happened. Jesus looked directly at her. Then, as calmly as before, he bent down slightly and carefully handed the boy back into his mother's arms. The woman, with trembling hands, held her son as if he were the most precious thing in the world. She hugged him to her chest, her body being overcome by a new wave of tears, but now they were tears of gratitude. She held the boy's head with one hand while the other caressed his back, feeling the heat of his body, his weight, his breathing. He was there. He was alive. The boy hugged her back. Her small body was still wet, but it was warm. He snuggled into his mother's arms, feeling a love as deep as the peace that Jesus had left in his heart. Some women cried in silence, others whispered prayers of gratitude. They were also mothers. They knew what that woman had felt, and they knew that this was a moment that no words could ever describe it. The men of the village, who so often tried to hide their emotions, they couldn't avoid the impact of what they had just witnessed. Many lowered their heads, squinting their eyes, trying to hold back the tears. But how can you contain your emotions when faced with something like this? How could they remain indifferent to what they had just seen? Jesus stepped back, allowing mother and son to have their moment. But he still watched them with a look full of love and understanding. The crowd remained speechless, still absorbing the meaning of what had happened. Until that day, many of them believed that destiny was unchangeable, that when the river took someone, there was no turning back. But now they knew there was something bigger, something that transcended even the forces of nature. Someone in the crowd muttered softly, "This is God's work." Another repeated, now out loud, "This can only be the work of God." And one by one, the villagers began to affirm what their hearts already knew. What they had seen was not just a miracle, it was a living proof that faith has power. Jesus looked at them once again, his gaze filled with something indescribable, a mixture of compassion, love, and a deep knowledge that no one there could fully understand. He knew that that moment wouldn't just change the life of that child and his family, it would change everyone's lives there. And then, without rushing, he turned around. His feet touched the firm earth of the bank, leaving light footprints on the damp sand. Every villager followed his every move, because now no one wanted to take their eyes off Jesus. What if today you heard these words directly from Jesus? After witnessing a miracle before your eyes, feeling his presence, would you believe that faith can actually save lives? How would this change the way you see the world? I want to know your opinion. Right here in the comments. Faith can move mountains and save lives. This story certainly touched you, and it can touch even more people. Share with someone who needs to hear this message, because some stories are not meant to be forgotten. They need to be told. And what happens next will touch everyone's hearts even more. Silence still dominated the village. The sound of water rushing down the river seemed distant now, like a distant echo of something that had tried to defy the impossible. But in the end, it had no power against the presence of Jesus. Dust kicked up by the wind hung in the air, sparkling in the sunlight. Every face there reflected a mixture of amazement, reverence, and emotion. The miracle they had witnessed was not just a display of power, it was something much bigger. Was living proof that true faith can transcend any obstacle. Jesus remained there, in the center of everyone, looking around with serenity. His eyes passed over each face, each expression still stunned by what they had seen. He didn't need to ask what they were thinking. He already knew. The boy's mother still held her son in her arms, feeling the heat of his body, listening to his rhythmic and calm breathing. The son she believed she had lost was now there, safe and sound. The fear that had consumed her heart was replaced by something she could barely name. It was faith. It was then that Jesus broke the silence. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that crossed every heart present there. You saw it with your own eyes. What seemed impossible happened. The villagers were still kneeling. Some lowered their heads, as if recognizing that they were facing something much greater than they could understand. Others just looked at Jesus, without blinking, as if his every word was something precious, something they needed to engrave within their soul. Jesus took a few steps forward, and the circle of people around him opened up, as if everyone instinctively knew that they needed to hear what he would say. You feared the river because you believed it had absolute power. But what you saw today proves that nothing, absolutely nothing, is above God's will. Murmurs began among the crowd. It was true. All their lives they had respected the river as an uncontrollable force. He took those he wanted to take. He decided who stayed and who went. But that day, the river lost. The current, which before seemed untamed, he had no strength against Jesus. Jesus looked directly at the boy's mother. His gaze was one of compassion and love, but also of something more. You cried, you feared, and you believed there was no hope. But in the most difficult moment, when everything seemed lost, what was left inside you? The woman opened her mouth to respond, but her voice trailed off. The tears ran down her face again, and she hugged her son to her chest. She knew the answer: faith. She had been overcome with despair, yes, but the moment she saw Jesus there, when her eyes met his, something inside her had changed. Fear was replaced by the certainty that he was in control. Jesus turned to the other villagers. Faith can move mountains, it can save lives, but for that you need to believe, even when everything seems impossible. The words echoed in the soul of every person there. What they had seen, it wasn't just a miracle, it was a lesson, a living message about the nature of God's love and intervention. The man closed his eyes, absorbing those words. Their truth penetrated deeply, destroying all the certainties he had before that day. Jesus continued, God never ignores suffering. He never stops listening to those who cry out to him. But the question you must ask is, do you really trust him? Or do they only trust when the waters are calm? The impact of those words was like lightning piercing hearts. How many times had they doubted? How many times had they thought they were alone? The truth was painful but freeing. They had learned to fear the river, but they had not learned to trust God enough. Jesus took a few more steps, walking through the crowd. He looked each one in the eye, for those who still held back tears, for those who trembled, for those who still tried to understand. True faith is not just believing when everything is going well. It's not trusting when the sun is shining and life seems peaceful. He paused. Every word was absorbed as if it were food for the soul. True faith reveals itself when the storm arrives, when fear grips the heart, when the waters rise and it seems like there is no way out. The boy who was in his mother's arms looked at Jesus with shining eyes. He didn't understand all the words, but I felt the weight of what was happening. The mother squeezed her son once more, and then he looked at Jesus with a conviction he hadn't had before. "I understand." His voice came out as a whisper. "Faith was what saved my son." Jesus smiled. "Faith always saves." The people around them murmured among themselves, exchanging glances, trying to fully understand everything that had been said. But deep down, it was not something to be understood with the mind. It was something to be felt with the heart. Jesus looked at everyone there one last time. His gaze carried everything that words could not say. He knew they had been transformed. And then he started to walk away. The sun was shining in the sky, but somehow it felt warmer, more welcoming. Faith now dwelt in that place. But at that moment, nothing seemed the same anymore. Something invisible had changed. The wind blew gently, as if even nature was in awe of what had just happened. The villagers were still there, silent, absorbing every detail of the miracle they witnessed. No one dared to move quickly, as if they were afraid of breaking that sacred instant. The boy, safe in his mother's arms, looked around with big, curious eyes. His little heart was beating fast, no longer out of fear, but out of something he couldn't explain. He was alive. I had felt the cold of the river, the despair of being swept away, the feeling that everything was lost. And then Jesus came. Now the crowd tried to understand. They had witnessed something that words could not describe. The impossible happened before his eyes. And what did that mean for each of them? The wind blew gently through the village, bringing with it the fine dust that mixed with the heat of the day. The sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the stone houses and gnarled trees that surrounded the village. But despite the day following its natural course, nothing there was like before. The villagers were still in shock. What they had seen, it wasn't just a story to be told on cold nights around the fire. It was something that would forever be engraved in their souls. A miracle, something that it defied any explanation, any logic, any natural law. Jesus was already a little ways away, walking slowly along the dirt path that led out of the village. But no one could take their eyes off Jesus. The boy, safe in his mother's arms, now slept peacefully, as if his body knew it was safe, as if somehow he had understood that his life had been rescued for something much bigger than he could imagine. What had just happened? It wasn't a chance. It wasn't luck. It was divine intervention. And to those who testified, that would change everything. Jesus didn't look back. He never needed recognition. He never expected applause. He never wanted to be exalted as earthly kings desired. Your sole purpose has always been to bring the truth, to bring love, to show the way. And he had just done it once again. The villagers didn't know what to say. How do you process something like this? How to explain it to those who weren't there? How can you describe what it was like to see a man walk on water, defy the current, and with a single gesture snatch a life from the brink of death? The elders said that the river never gave back those it took. But that day, the river failed. The river tried to take, tried to drown, tried to win. But Jesus' power was greater, and that meant something. It had to mean something. The boy's mother, still holding her son to her chest, looked at Jesus one last time before he disappeared between the houses. Tears were streaming down her face, but now they were of gratitude. She didn't know how to thank him. No words seemed enough, But deep down, she felt that he already knew, because he always knew. She would never be the same again, and neither does the entire village. What if today you witnessed a miracle like this, right before your eyes? Would you fall to your knees, overcome with emotion? Would you cry without being able to hold back your tears? Or would you simply be paralyzed, trying to understand the impossible happening before you? I want to know your opinion right here in the comments. I believe in the impossible. What happened that day in that village was more than a miracle. It was a calling. A call to open your eyes, to see beyond what is visible, to understand that true faith can transform any situation. It can reverse any destiny. And now I ask you, do you believe that faith can save lives? Then leave your like and share this story with someone who needs to hear this message today. Maybe someone who is going through a difficult time. Someone who needs to remember that faith always wins. And tell me, are you ready to discover something even more impactful? There are stories so surprising that were hidden for centuries, miracles so powerful that defy explanation. And the next story could be the most incredible thing you've ever heard. Tell me in the comments, what did this story awaken in you? Do you believe that Jesus still intervenes in people's lives today? Write it below. Faith always saves. And see you in the next video, because this was just one of the many stories that need to be told, the hidden stories of Jesus.